Welcome to Stewart Squared, and we're going to do things a little bit different today. Today, my dad is going to interview me rather than me interview him about the history, but it'll probably wrap up and go on to little tangents back into the history of everything.
It'll go back and forth, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
But yeah, we want to start with you're in the US right now, but you live in Buenos Aires. And you're doing something that I can't even begin to understand, which you call residency hacking. I don't even know how to do hacking. So it's like hacking is for young people. And but you got to tell me about this because you went to South Dakota, got a driver's license there, and now established residency in that state, even though you live in Buenos Aires. I'm like totally confused. You got to tell me about this.
yeah. We'll straighten it out. So, yeah, and I went through all my mail yesterday, and mail is something from your generation, which somehow the IRS thinks that the only way they can get in touch is through the mail, and that's the absolute worst way to get in touch with a millennial. And I've got a bunch of bills here from the IRS that I've like totally freaked me out, and my insurance companies, all these different things. And so this is a symptom of the fact that your generation, you guys moved city to city, and in my generation, we came up with digital nomading, and digital nomading not only move city to city, but have no permanent residence. And so I've gone back and forth for the last 10 years. I've been living in other countries. I was a digital nomad before digital nomads existed, but I didn't work in other countries on my laptop. I would go and study abroad in different countries. So that was the first way that I initially got into living in other countries, and I would save a bunch of money because the cost of living was cheaper in Thailand and Brazil and all these different places. So I've been doing this for 15 years, but that was all temporary residences on a student visa. Once the student visa is up, you have to leave. Now, as San Francisco has changed drastically and is no longer the place that I really, really want to live, Buenos Aires has become sort of like a magnet for me, and I want to live there long term, which I've never done before. And I've thought about it in Brazil.
And
And
so the objective is to become a resident of Argentina, right? To have a
well,
passport.
well, no. So there's a difference between residency and citizenship. But
Yeah.
in Argentina, it is one of the easiest places to do both. Residency is never an easy process, but Argentina is relatively easier than everywhere else, and very different from every other country. Citizenship is extremely easy. All you have to do for citizenship is be in the country for 2 years. And you're going to love this if I've not already told you before. The Russians, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, when the war initially set off and the government started to do forced recruitment, the Russian and Ukrainian couples who didn't want to fight in the war moved to Argentina because they found a loophole, which is that if you have your child in Argentina, both of the parents get the citizenship as well. So I
Fascinating.
could, so that would be one way I could do it if I found an Argentine. If I married an Argentine, I would get it, but that opens up a whole bunch of other liabilities, and that also works in Brazil. But Argentina is the easiest because all I have to go do is live there for 2 years. You can do it illegally, which many Brazilians, Bolivians, Peruvians are doing right now. They just live there and they force the system to make them give them a passport and everything like that, or live legally. It's very easy to live in Argentina illegally. Uh, and this all stems from Argentina's particular history, which we can go into later, which is
Yeah, let's try to do that separately because you'll
yeah,
lose a thread if you
yeah.
do.
So, but basically, in order to do it legally, then I have to get residency for two years. I tried going, and this is the funny thing about the difference between the U.S. system and the Argentine system. The Argentine system, even the lawyers don't really know what's going on. So I talked to lawyers, and I went through the online immigration system. I went to cooking school, thinking that the cooking school was going to give me the right visa for a long-term residency, which will eventually get me the passport. Turned out that that was not the case, and that there's only one way to do it, which is to get permanent residency on a rentista visa, which is a passive income visa, showing that you have passive income. And they only accept two forms of passive income. One is a pension, like if you're older. Number two is rental income from a rental house. And I have to get all the documentation. Thus, why I'm back in California getting all this documentation so I can go get a residency. There are other countries all over the world that offer this residency. There's Mexico is a prime spot. A lot of people do this for business. So as you may know, Dubai has become a hotspot particularly for European entrepreneurs who no longer want to deal with the European bureaucracy of doing business in Europe. Dubai makes it really easy. Then there's Singapore. Singapore is very expensive, but is also a world-class city that you can essentially live in if you have that, if you're playing at that level. Argentina for me is really interesting because I find Dubai and Singapore to be fake, whereas Argentina is a real country with a real history and an interesting socio-political revolution going on. And really the cherry on the cake is that it's a walkable, beautiful, walkable city that is sunny year round, which the only other one of those in the Western Hemisphere is San Francisco. So that's the whole scoop.
It's like the flip side of San Francisco because it's in the Southern Hemisphere.
Yep.
So winter here is summer there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so residency hacking.
Yeah.
So part of this whole scheme is you wanted to establish residency in a different state than California.
Well, that only comes up. This is the other part of it. I was aware of this train because I was living in a van for a while and I had no permanent residency. And so this part of it the only reason I did that is because I'm now living in Argentina. I'm not living in California anymore, and I need to make an official move out of California. But California doesn't accept my move to Argentina as a move out of the state. So I had to move out of the state of California in some sort of official way. And I found out from the van life people, usually it's people who live in their RVs, retired people who travel around the United States going from place to place. They go to South Dakota and they spend one night in South Dakota, and then South Dakota prints them a driver's license and they put all their vehicles in South Dakota. And also South Dakota has great trust laws as well. And so that's why I went to South Dakota in order to establish my state out of California, because now that I'm living in Argentina. And there's another interesting thing there too, is that as long as I get the residency in Argentina, then the US will give me tax forgiveness because I'll be out of the country for long periods of time. So there's an agreement between Argentina and the US that as long as I have residency in Argentina, I'm no longer liable for 150,000 or something like that in taxes. And I'm not an expert. Nobody should treat this as advice.
Yeah, don't treat this as tax or investment advice or even living advice. But
yeah. Yeah, it's very complicated. I deal with bureaucracies, and I've always hated dealing with bureaucracies. And now the United States system is becoming almost unworkable. The amount of bureaucratic nonsense that I've been involved in the last 3 months would have destroyed an earlier version of me. But now I spend all my time thinking about it and dealing with it.
So I think that might be genetic. Not very good at paper myself.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you mentioned this thing about we tend to move from one place to another and then we change our address, but you don't have an address.
Yep.
So you mentioned at some point that you have a service that will receive your mail and then send you scans.
Yeah, so that's actually the reason why South Dakota works, and I would have done that alone even if I were didn't change the state. And so the way that South Dakota requires you to have an address. And so I set up with a system called Dakota Post, and Dakota Post, they give me an address, and that's my official address now. And what they do is they scan all my mail, thankfully, because I've got a pile of mail sitting behind me that my tenants weren't giving to me with all sorts of important information that I found out last night, 3 to 4 months late. So that will solve that problem of now I have a dedicated place where the mail will all go.
So you're going to have to change the address for all those mail.
And that's through the USPS. So I went on the USPS and paid them $1, and now they're going to forward all my mail starting at a certain date.
So I still get one piece of mail for you from the California Department of Health Services, I think it is, that you registered at some point for California insurance.
Oh, God. And it was at your house.
I was at Larkin Street in San Francisco, and that keeps coming to Larkin Street. I'm still getting it there. I don't live there and haven't lived there for 4 years. And the lady who owns the house now very kindly lets me know when I have mail that I cannot get them to change the address or stop sending the mail. It's like,
this goes in probably how this might be more interesting for the listeners, is that we're changing from the industrial age to the information age. You are a key part of the information age and the industrial age from the information to the information age, and you were doing a very information age thing, which is journalism, which has also changed quite drastically. And so this mail is a holdover from the Industrial Revolution, and it's
Yeah.
so, yeah,
There's a thing about the U.S. Postal Service where I don't know the number, probably look it up while I'm saying here, but there is some percentage of the mail delivered by the U.S. postal system that is pure commercial junk
yeah,
mail.
yeah.
And it's like 90 something percent, right? So the original idea of the U.S. Postal Service, uh, whether it's sleet or snow or rain, the carrier will get that mail to you. That is gone.
Yeah.
Except for old people, even older than me, because I don't use it either. I'm astonished. I get all junk mail now because I'm on e-delivery on my banks and everything else. I got
And so
everything in.
it's all junk mail except for the IRS, and
Certain institutions that still haven't figured out how to deal with email.
so yeah, and so here's another.
Actually, just so
Okay.
you know, the Social Security system sends me email, and
Uh-huh.
IRS is somewhat different, but I actually think I might get that by email, but it goes to someone else, so I don't know.
Oh, interesting. So you got your IRS setting up to okay, that's
We
interesting.
file my taxes electronically.
Well, I filed my taxes electronically, and this is why I need to get a new accountant because apparently they didn't do it right. And I've got a bill for like $2,000 that was late now, and they're adding up fees. But so you might like, as to your point about junk mail. So now the USPS has actually maybe sold themselves out to it, and they started asking me to sign up for newsletters to Bed Bath and Beyond and other things. So the U.S. Postal Office is probably getting money from these companies to
Yep.
act as distribution.
They're generating leads for,
Yeah,
yeah,
and so they're
lead
getting
gen.
paid, right? Well, and how does
Yeah.
this? How does this
Well, they'll
like?
do anything. They lose so much money, the U.S. Postal Service, that the Congress is beginning to say, like, we're not going to give you money anymore because you just
Yeah,
lose money.
yeah.
And so trying to figure out anything they can to stay alive.
Okay, and this gets into interesting territory back into the history of technology because I'm reading this book about DARPA called The Imagineers of the Future. And it's so funny because DARPA in 1989, when the Soviet Union fell, was doing great technological work in computer science. They fell off from computer science in the 70s and the early 80s. They had originally built a networking between the different universities with ARPANET, and then they fell off and they started doing other things, trying to build bombs, targeted systems. Reagan came out. Reagan wanted them to do Star Wars, which was totally crazy, and so they fell off the computer science train. By the late 80s, they had the computer science back. They were starting AI, so they started AI, and they needed an enemy because the Soviet Union was no longer a good enemy. And so they chose Japan because, as you know, Japan the government itself was investing a lot inside of different entities within to promote Japanese business, and so they chose Japan as an enemy, saying, "Look at how much money they're investing into the U.S. Their economy is going to be too powerful. They're going to be a threat to the U.S." And DARPA basically chose them in order to get Congress to give them $1 billion to start out doing AI, all of which failed, all of which is now coming around.
It failed in Japan too, because it was a
Failed in Japan.
collective thing.
Yeah.
They were called Japan Inc. at the time. The thing that became iconic was a Japanese company bought the Rockefeller Center in New York City. And it's like they were the only ones that had enough money to buy that huge complex. I don't think they own it anymore, but it was like this thing, like everybody went, "Oh my God, Japan is buying Rockefeller Center."
And so
Um,
DARPA started to do venture capital style investments in a competitive silicon. Instead of silicon, it was like gallium arsenic. So the head of
gallium
DARPA,
arsenide,
that was
gallium
it,
arsenide, yeah,
gallium arsenide. And
yeah.
so the head of DARPA started to treat it like a venture capital investment, and he got the technical program manager on the board. But it was a total. It is then Bush found out about it and started going after him and fired the guy who did it. And this leads me to I was asking questions of myself about In-Q-Tel because In-Q-Tel didn't do that, right? They specifically avoided that. Did that have anything to do with DARPA?
In a kind of general sense, because a lot changed between
Uh-huh.
then and when In-Q-Tel was started. Incotel is not really a venture capital firm. It's sort of a fake venture capital firm. And there's carried interest, and it's modeled on venture capital. But in the government, individuals can't make money from what the government does. Um, so the carried interest didn't go to the individuals running Incotel. Instead, it went into a pool of money. And the basic pitch was that Incotel would not make money. It was like it was set up as a not-for-profit. So the controlling organization is a not-for-profit. Now it has kind of an embarrassment of riches because it actually did make money. And they can't give it back to Incotel, and they can't give it back to the government. So it's just sitting there getting bigger and bigger. So they're trying to find ways to use it that are, okay, but it's hard.
Yeah.
And mostly they've set up a foundation to support um, undercover CIA operatives' families. Right? If
Wow.
you get
Oh,
killed
cool.
while you're overseas undercover, you can't admit
Yeah.
that there was somebody there, so you can't give them any benefits, right? So their families like get stuck. So they've set up a foundation to support the families of undercover operatives that are. Anyways, I mean we were way off.
Well, no, no, no. So it still relates to the information age because what in the versus the industrial age and the shift from information industrial age, which was about factories, land, productive capabilities, and now it's all crazy because now it's all has to do with the mind and the mind being networked between
So,
minds.
are you familiar with Have you ever heard Pine and Gilmore?
No, what is this?
They came up with the concept. This is in the 90s, I think. Might have been in the 80s, of the experience economy. So
Uh,
they describe this is core to what we're doing as an investor, but the original economy was agricultural, and then the industrial economy came along, and then there's kind of an interim service economy, I think it was, and then that would inevitably lead to, which
mm,
is characteristic of young people, millennials and less, that they don't want to own things anymore. You're unusual for owning a house. They really want to buy experiences, right? To live through their experiences. And so these two guys at Harvard wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review called "The Experience Economy" by, I can't remember their first names, but Pine and Gilmore. And then they wrote a book, and the book was basically just an expansion of the article.
mm.
But that concept of the experience economy is now happening, and the irony is that my investment in Meow um, was really the first instance of
Mm,
selling an experience, right? That we were selling an immersive experience
mm.
in the Meow exhibits, and it was the first time somebody figured out how to create an experience that people were willing to pay for.
Well, and there have been small examples of this. I actually know of one in Buenos Aires, but it's like an eccentric rich guy who didn't plan on making any money. So there
Yeah, you
are,
told me about this. Yeah,
yeah, there are examples of these types of things, but Meow Wolf was the first one that scaled it, basically.
and was commercial, right? It
Mm,
was expected to make money.
mm.
A lot of the weird ones, and there are all over, like the City Museum in St. Louis, or um, there's a thing called Star Access, which is this guy that's been building this thing actually in New Mexico. Um, and then there's the permanent clock, which I think Bezos funded in West Texas, and um,
Stewart Brand, long now.
the Long Now Foundation. But I believe that Bezos funded the building of the clock. It's supposed to be the Long Now clock.
Mm.
Uh, and I mean, they're all over the place. You keep turning around, finding these things which are not inherently commercial. So that's the distinction, is that Meow decided to sell tickets and become a business.
Okay, this is really interesting territory because it gets into ownership. Uh, there's ownership, there's equity, and this relates to AI because so many people predict a future of UBI, of humans now being
Just
deleveraged
to be
out of
clear,
this.
universal basic income.
Yeah. And humans are basically being deleveraged outside of the economy. And these people are predicting a fully AI economy to exist, and that AI economy to be owned by the people who own the capital because the capital gets put into it. And then the AI will then be so good at generating capital all those things. But I find it funny because we've been discussing AI a lot. You have a take that there's no value. I have a take that there's essentially value, but it's accruing to the employees because the employees are becoming superpowered inside the organization, but it's their minds themselves underneath their skin that's totally separate from the corporation that the corporation pays for. So the corporation's actually going to like pay more for people who can essentially get AI to do their work for them rather than somebody who can't do that. And so it's actually giving leverage to the employees. That's what I believe is happening. And so it's totally different from this sort of dystopian world where the AI is just going to generate its own income, but it gets into ownership of experiences, ownership of the experience economy. Meow Wolf made a lot of money. And I don't really have anywhere specific I'm going with this, but yeah,
Okay.
yeah. What do you think?
Lost me.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, you did lose me. Um, yeah, even with Meow, if you don't own the experience, you rent it, you pay a ticket price and go in and have it.
What, but what do you think is going to happen with AI? What do you think about this UBI scenario where AI
I think
just starts?
UBI is a different issue than AI.
But
UBI
UBI is,
is kind of structural changes that have happened in our economy where it's created this incredible distance between being poor and being rich with very little in between. So the sort of fundamental idea behind UBI is that use all the wealth that's been created to essentially guarantee a minimum income.
hmm.
Just give people money.
But
Universal basic income, so the government distributes it. So rather than filing taxes, you get a check every year or every month or whatever the period is
but
from the government. But that means the government has to, collect enough money to redistribute it.
but those structural changes are specifically to the information age change because, and I think the first one was one that you personally witnessed, which was that Silicon Valley used to be producing the silicon chips. Then and the not only silicon chips, but the whole United States used to have all these factories. And then partly, actually, it was all due to the information age because the information age allowed people to work remotely. And then so they shifted the actual physical production to lower income countries where it could be cheaper. One example is Taiwan, and Taiwan's now the owner of the semiconductors, although that's changing. So you have this, but that's one part. And then so AI, the reason why the connection between UBI and AI is because AI people then extend that further and say, okay, well, humans are about to be completely taken out, except at that ownership level. But then, as you alluded to, the sort of like, how do you actually tax this? Because most of the people who are making this type of money are fleeing to Dubai or fleeing to Singapore with all of their money because Singapore charges only 18% on corporate taxes and everything like that. And then within the US, they have all these loopholes that are getting around it. So it's a complex web.
I'm going to Dal
Dolly.
watch Dali, right?
Yeah.
Dali,
Yep.
the movie.
Yep.
The very opening sequence is an incredible dystopian view of the world where, Dali is the robot that survives in the garbage dump of humanity. And humanity, meanwhile, is sitting in these pods being fed and both TV and food, and they're all big blobs. It's amazing that came out of was Pixar, but Disney.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you can kind of go that way, or you can say there's something else to be done here. The whatever happens going to happen after I hope I'm not going to be here at that time, and that's up to you. The but there is this tendency to choose either the Dali version or the UBI version, which is really utopian. And so I want, and I'm happy to recommend it here while we're talking about it. Ezra Klein just did an interview with a historian that tracks. He basically posits it as a new political order in the U.S. forming, but it hasn't formed yet. And we're in the middle of it. And that's why it's sort of chaotic and can't tell if it's Harris versus Trump or, is Trump going to destroy the country or Harris going to be a weak knee? And, you can't really tell what's going on. It feels chaotic. that's trackable. There's a pattern there that Ezra Klein talks to this guy about, who wrote a book about how political orders emerge in the American election system. And so um, it's a really useful thing to listen to, because he does track back through from after World War II through Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ, Nixon, et cetera, et cetera. And he actually spots Jimmy Carter as being the guy that was elected the last time the political order changed. So he'd give
Hmm.
speeches where he'd like say one thing, they'd say another thing, and they were in like conflict with each other. And this is why everybody thought Jimmy Carter was kind of a weak. I can't say
Yeah.
was, is kind of a weak,
Yeah.
still alive at the age of
Yeah.
100.
Yeah.
Um, that he was not a really good leader, because he was sitting there trying to figure out, well, am I like an old Democrat or a new, you know, it's a really interesting thing to listen to. The podcast, I assume the book would be really interesting
Yeah.
too.
And I got the name of the guy. It's Gary Gersel.
Yeah, that
So
guy.
yeah, Gary Gersel, and about political orders in American history and the current state of U.S. politics. He tracks the New Deal order from the 1930s to the 1970s, and the neoliberal order from the 1970s to the financial crisis. And this brings exactly into what I've been studying with Crazy Wisdom, which I bring onto this show every once in a while, which is that there's something that happened in the 1960s which led to the New Left, but
Yep.
not only the New Left, it also led to a whole bunch of things that are going on in San Francisco that have all spread out as well. And also currently the area where I am in Nevada County is also it's where all the hippies left San Francisco after there was a conservative revolution or conservative counter revolution in the 1970s in San Francisco that basically kicked out all the back to the earth hippies, and they spread out all over California, establishing farms in this area is where a lot of them went, including all the underground psychedelic therapists and everything like that.
They're in Mendocino County.
So there's the golden, no, it's the Emerald Triangle
Okay.
between Nevada County, Mendocino, and I think probably San Francisco or Marin County or something like that. Yeah.
Solano County, I think is in. But,
But this
yeah,
neoliberal order that started in the 1960s in that sort of thing, and then and because
yeah,
it,
it's as a reaction to uh, well, I was really, after World War II. This is what this guy talks about, but
yeah.
basically the children were like in college or beginning to go to college in the 60s, and they're going like, what the fuck,
Mm.
basically, and going, I'm going to go smoke pot and stick flowers and guns. And,
Yeah. Well, because
you
the
know,
Vietnam War was going on, and that
well,
was
it actually happened a little later, because it was
yeah,
just beginning in the early 60s.
yeah,
And then it became the iconic example of why you couldn't trust the old people.
yeah. And which is
And
now
the Democrats, and this is what I got out
yeah,
of this, the Democrats really seeded the distrust people have for them.
yeah.
And the fact that Biden was an old Democrat, he went back to the,
Mm,
Great Society and Lyndon Baines Johnson, just spent a lot of money here. We're just going to spend a lot of
yeah,
money. We're going to
exactly,
fix the world
exactly.
problems.
Yeah.
And people are going like, well, what the fuck? I mean, the country can't afford that. So that's where Trump's appeal comes,
And
although that's weird.
well, yeah, yeah. And this is the hard part for anybody. Not like I don't think that Trump is ready to solve the problems that we have. I think we have a lot of problems that he's not ready to solve. But in contrast to you and the rest of the family, I think that Harris is actually really bad for free speech, and I'm really pro free speech. And so, but like what you just described is the fact that nobody trusts the system anymore. I don't trust the system. As
They
I
don't
just
trust either side
yeah,
or any of this. Yes, they do
yeah.
not. I don't. I'm here and I'm 72 years old, and I'm going like, I don't believe any of this stuff. Right now, I was
So,
growing
and,
up in the 60s.
yeah,
So
and this is actually something that's been going on my mind, and I'm actually really glad uh, that because when I remember growing up, I should tell the story that I was reminded of when I saw my other sister Catherine in Minnesota. We both went in 2003 to a conference or some sort of event with George Bush, where George Bush was giving it. So you were a supporter of the Republicans in a neocon kind of thing, right? But let me
yeah,
tell
I mean,
this.
it's
Yeah,
complicated, but yeah,
yeah,
I mean, because when you say Republican, people are going to think what Republican means now versus what it meant then, and
yeah.
a lot of people think that George W. was a evil person, which I don't agree with. But so it's complicated. But yeah,
Yeah. But
I
do
took
you,
you. What? No,
Yeah,
what? I
yeah.
don't know where Catherine came into this because I took you to a speech she was giving, and I miscalculated how long it would take to get through security, so we actually missed the speech. But along the way, while we were going into the venue, we saw your sister Natalie demonstrating on the other side of the street.
We heard her
That
voice.
was the
We heard her voice
No, we
outside.
saw her on a.
Yeah.
She had a loudspeaker.
Yeah.
So I looked across the street and I said, "Wow, there's your sister Natalie on the other side."
And so that was, but you were sort of like, can you describe your political orientation? Because you came after the hippies in the 1960s. You in the 1970s was when you started to get your career going, and then the 1980s was really when the personal computing industry popped off.
If you listen to this podcast, this
Yeah.
historian guy talks about the personal computer
Oh,
as the sort of natural evolution of the flower power
yeah.
and hippie kids, right?
Okay.
Because all the people that started PC companies were just starting out in their careers.
So can you talk more about like your because you are a contrarian and so it was contrarian to be conservative in 1980s and 1990s. Most of the people in that, like Steve Jobs, were on the left, right?
Oh, that's really hard to pin down.
Yeah.
I came out of it, having grown up in DC with my father, who never clearly established what he
But
believed
they were
or
old school
party.
Democrats. They were old school. I'm rereading that they were old school
Yeah,
Democrats before
the
the new left.
Alsop family was, but my father always sat in the
Oh,
middle, just trying to look at both sides and trying to figure out, what was true. That was why people appreciated him so much, much more than your great Uncle Joe, who
because he
clearly
was
took one side and
he
was
was a
deep in.
Democrat. Because Great Uncle Joe was a full on Democrat.
It was a full-on Democrat. He hosted JFK at his house when on the night of his inauguration, and but he was also a hawk. So it's
Mm,
really hard.
yeah,
He,
yeah,
he thought we should have prosecuted Vietnam much more aggressively than
yeah,
we did.
yeah. Well, this is the thing about that's so interesting about America. Now it's polarized. Now we can't say Republican, Democrat. Democrat all of a sudden is like for the but it's weird. It's weird again because all the things that are seeping up that are going to create this new political order are going to lead to something that's
So this has
solid.
happened before,
Yeah,
right? One of my anecdotes is when Obama was running for president, he cited a book about Lincoln becoming president
yeah,
called A Team of Rivals.
yeah.
So I went and bought it and read it. It was still in print, right? Kindle hadn't come out at the time, or it was just coming out. And so I was reading the book, and I'm sitting in a chair reading the book, and about three-quarters of the way through in the book, there's one sentence that says, the chairman of the National Republican Convention in 1854 was, well, probably 53, but was the editor in chief of the New York Times.
Mm.
I was like a double whammy because
Mm,
like this is the Republican Party,
mm.
and the everybody agrees that the New York Times is a liberal democratic newspaper,
Yep.
right? The old gray lady, they very definitely represent that point of view. So I had to put the book down. I physically put it down, and I went to myself like, "What the heck?" And the Republican Party, there was a new party in 1854, and Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican, the first president,
Yeah,
first person
yeah,
elected as a Republican president.
yeah,
That's because the Whig Party, which was kind of the predecessor, had fallen apart,
yeah.
and the Republican Party had been formed. Well, the New York Times was started in like 1852 as a Republican paper in
Yeah,
a city, New York, where
yeah,
there were like 27 daily newspapers.
yeah,
So every one of the 27 daily newspapers had a political point of view,
yeah,
and the
yeah.
one that wasn't represented in the 1850s was the Republican Party, and they were the Liberal Party. They're the ones that freed the slaves. So so when did
Oh,
that change? Right? When did the Republicans come, the conservatives, and the Democrats came the liberals? It all shifted, and it did incrementally over time. And a lot happened in the 1890s and 1900 because of the Industrial Revolution,
yeah.
right? In the Industrial Revolution, people went to work in factories, they moved into cities, and there was nobody to represent them. And the Democrats ended up taking that position, largely through people that were elected, like Teddy Roosevelt or before that. And I mean, these shifts happen, and they happen on a regular basis. That's why this podcast is so interesting, because basically, Ezra Klein and this guy are talking about it's going on right now, but we don't know where it's going to end up. right? And on Tuesday we'll get a
Well, and
pretty good indication. But
this is
so
why I think
you're going to vote on Tuesday.
well, I am, and I'll explain it now that you just called it out. But the so I think that the whole reason this system works, the whole reason that this system, just the way you set it up, is that it's allowed to shift from side to side, and there's a new party, all comes from the First Amendment, free speech. It's all based on the fact that
There's a bunch of the whole Constitution basically has this whole system of checks
yep.
and balances.
Yeah. But it's the First Amendment, and I'll go back to why it's so important. Is the classical liberals, which in the U.S. liberal means something very different from the classical liberals. The reason why I'm so focused on this word is because Javier Milei is a classical liberal, and the classical liberals.
If you're listening, that's the president of Argentina, who was elected last year.
Yeah, the classical liberals. It's such an interesting time to go back into the Enlightenment and the history and to understand where the classical liberals come from. It comes from this humanism, from the scientific method that starts to go out and realize that, oh, these kings who have this political power, they're not representations of God. God may exist, and there's a whole bunch of can of worms in there, but they're not speakers for God. Their political power does not come from God. And so they can be questioned. And when you question them, they don't like it. And so the founders of the United States were a new political party that happened only in the Western Hemisphere, that essentially recognized that. They saw this, they saw that the kings didn't like it, and they're like, we don't want a king. We want a republic.
Oh, we had a king. Yeah. Started with the Tea Party. Yeah.
And we want a republic, and we guarantee inalienable right that we can question the government, and we can express our what we think is going on, even if it's unpopular, even if it's against what the majority says. And so free speech is really important to me. And also, I've noticed from the history that free speech, the Alien and Seditions Act in early U.S. Republic was the first time that the free speech was challenged. It was later deemed unconstitutional, but that was the first time where there was a war between the UK and France, and it divided the U.S. and basically the people supporting France started to question a lot of things, and the people who supported England were like, you can't question them anymore, and because it's a question of the U.S. federal government, you can't talk bad about the U.S. federal government. That was the first, and so free speech has had a long and storied history. Many times the ideal wasn't taken up, and I think we're in a desperate time in terms of free speech right now, because there's been a lot of things that happened over the past ever since Trump got elected in 2016 that have been very, very contrary to the idea of free speech, and I was affected by many.
It's really not contrary. It's actually consistent, because the guy stands up there and says whatever the hell he wants to say.
Well,
he's protected by the free speech amendment to say whatever he wants, right, and not be challenged on it.
Yeah, well, but then this is the key part, is that I think I'm ambivalent on Trump himself. I don't think that represents what we really need, which is a balanced budget. Like, if we were to have a Javier Milei, that would be very interesting for me, but Trump doesn't represent that. But people have gone so crazy because of what Trump represents to them that they're now taking apart the free speech, and they're doing it pretty comprehensively throughout the government and in foreign governments.
Okay, so relevant to this, and this is Ezra Klein again. Listen to the one before the political order one. It's an interview with Vivek Ramaswamy, and it's a really interesting thing. I mean, because Ezra Klein is a Jewish liberal guy, but he tries to stand in the middle and watch what other people are saying. Vivek Ramaswamy is, well, that way.
Right.
And it's really interesting, because he listened to Vivek Ramaswamy. He makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like, he wants to fire 3/4 of the federal employees the day he's elected president. Well, he's not running anymore, but and
that's what he represents.
It's very Milei, right? Because basically our bureaucracy is so big and spending so much money that there's no rational way to manage it, right? You can't say, oh, we'll make it 10% less. You have to whack at it. And this experiment is going on in Argentina. He doesn't cite Argentina, by the way, but it's it is there are parallels, right? What's really weird is our economy is kind of chugging along, at least by official measures, right? Our unemployment's low, and inflation's been tamed, and we're creating new jobs up the last month, and so it's like really weird. It's hard to figure out.
Yep.
The Democrats went out and spent all this money, and apparently
Yep.
it has really kind of stimulated the economy, but without creating inflation. It's like weird.
Yep. Yeah, it's
Nobody can figure out what's going on.
this is the thing I'm trying to figure out about what I call jokingly the magical money theory, which they call the monetary there's some word for it called MMT, and I call it
Yeah.
magical money theory because the idea is that you can essentially peg inflation at 2% because somehow they figured out that 2% is the way that gets the most jobs going without with the least everything like that, and so that
Balanced economy.
yeah. And so the way you get to 2% is you actually print a lot of money and then invest that money. You get the Federal Reserve to give money to the banks at low interest rates, and then that money spreads out, and you create money. You just created a whole bunch of money in the database, and then somehow there's no backlash to that.
The thing is, it is a database. It used to be actually printed money, right?
Yeah,
The amount of printed money in circulation was the money supply. Now it's become much more abstract.
yeah. And so we
But
had 2008. 2008 was a symptom of that MMT, but then the once that became clear, once that loophole that had been found with the financial derivatives had been basically opened up, the Congress closed that particular loophole. So that particular black swan event can't happen again. But there are probably a whole bunch of other black swan events that could probably.
in the process, they got rid of Glass-Steagall, which was the sort of core
Yeah, what's
thing
that?
about banking that separated investment banks and commercial banks so that they had a clear role to play. Now
Wait,
you can be, and that partially was a result of 2008, but they got rid of the very thing that could have controlled it. Anyway, we're deep into the weeds now, but
we can wrap it up because this was a conversation about the industrial revolution, industrial age versus the information age. Now that we're in the information age, we're very clearly into the information age, but the industrial age is on its last legs, I would say, or industrial age thinking is on its last legs.
well, that's really hard to say because right now the sort of great power competition between the U.S. and China is China's making everything. And we
Yeah,
need to make stuff, and make stuff as
yeah.
part of the old industrial age, right? So
American
that's
dynamism.
really the Republican point of view. To make America great again is to make it more of an industrial power again.
Yeah, but there's no way, I will predict there's no way that American dynamism will be a repeat of the American dynamism from 1890s to 1960s
Totally
because
agree. Totally agree.
it's all
It's
going to
a
be
it's a it's a chimera. It's an illusion. It's hallucination,
yeah.
right? That we're going to go and start making shit again.
Well, no, I think we are going to start making shit, but the robots will be making it. It's not going to be human beings making it. And I do think that we will have American dynamism and we will be competitive with China, but it's not going to be a return. And this is why the UBI becomes more interesting to talk about. Is that the 360 million Americans are not going to get jobs where they can go into a factory. Like that isn't coming back. That's totally gone, and that needs to be recognized in the new political order, and that's going to be really hard.
So you're a neoliberal.
How so? How did can you explain why I'm a neoliberal because of that comment?
At least coming out of that podcast that I listened to, the way that he defined neoliberal is it was kind of the humanist way of thinking about things. That the
Ooh,
objective was to create a better society that
yeah.
took care of everybody. But one of the issues is that Democrats created a society which didn't take care of everybody like it was promised in the Great Society. So if you compare it to,
Yeah, interesting.
J.D. Vance and Trump and the other side's just about kind of a mechanical thing of to cut costs, it'll all be good. But it really doesn't take care of people. So neoliberalism, I only just really figured out what neoliberalism is by listening to this podcast over the last
Well,
few
no,
days.
and it's something. So I was very much a neoliberal before 2020, and then with what I see happen in 2020, I think the neoliberals went pretty crazy because of Trump derangement syndrome, and so now I distance myself from it, but I am still at my core a humanist, and there's another, and this is interesting because the neoliberals are now the supporter of the transhumanism, along with Elon Musk, who's on the right. He's actually creating the infrastructure for transhumanism. I'm pretty opposed to that whole merging with the machine, and I think it's outside of the humanist values. It's outside of the Enlightenment. But I don't know what to do. I'm super confused. I don't know what I am. I'm not even sure if
That's
I am.
because we're in the middle of a change of
Yeah,
political order, right? We don't have a choice. We're
yeah,
sitting here going like, well, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but I can't
yeah,
figure out what it is. It's
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah. Okay, well
so
that's
we didn't totally get home, but because you're a residency hacker,
yeah,
you
yeah.
don't have an address. It's like,
Well, now I do in South Dakota. Now I'm a South Dakota resident. So
yeah, but you're
I'm
actually living in Buenos Aires and you're turning into an Argentinian. And, I got rid of all my houses. I'm like down to one. And all mine, I used to have two, but
yeah,
so now I just live here in Santa Fe and I'm a Santa Fean and it's part of my self-image.
identity. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's kind of wrapping it up is that was the whole difference between your generation and my generation. Was your generation, you moved from Boston to San Francisco, but then you set up in San Francisco. Now you're in Santa Fe, but that's but it's like the one-way move. Whereas for my generation, it's the let's move all the time and be sort of nomadic. Yeah. But now
Living
as I get
outside the
older,
country,
yeah,
you're challenging the U.S. borders because you're actually really living in Argentina, but you're trying to still pretend that you're in the U.S., but you're in South Dakota.
yeah. And the key thing is whether I can build a business completely remotely from Argentina. This is the key
Yeah.
challenge because and I've been in San Francisco for the past week, and I've been meeting really interesting founders building electrical flying cars, and whether I can still sort of, as you said, pretend to be in San Francisco and earn the same sort of living that I could in San Francisco, but from Buenos Aires is the next goal. Yeah.
See you next week.
See you next week.